University of Chicago. And I'm also the faculty director of the Chicago Center on Democracy, which is a center that organizes research and activities, both for the UC community, the University of Chicago community, and outside communities about democracy, democratization, the health of democracies. And we are just delighted to have you here today. This is a conversation, a kind of informal conversation with very well-informed folks about sort of what our country just went through. What, how close did we come to losing our democracy? What were the sort of issues that seemed most salient to the set of scholars who are experts on American democracy and constitutional democracy? And so I'm going to introduce them. But let me just say first, we're really happy to have folks in the audience, and we are anxious to take your questions. So this is sort of set up as a conversation more than as a panel presentation. I will ask our panelists a few questions, but please do feel free to ask questions. And the way to do that is to raise your hand. If you look at the bottom right on your Zoom screen, you'll see there's a little reactions button. If you hit that button, there's a place where you can electronically raise your hand. And Kevin Cromash, who is the operations director of the Center on Democracy, is going to help us kind of identify folks to ask questions. So please do feel free to ask questions as we go along. Let me just introduce our panelists. I'm just going around my screen kind of clockwise. So first of all, Will Howell. Will is the Sidney Stein Professor of American Politics, and he's also the chair of the Political Science Department, so he's my boss, and at the University of Chicago. And among many other really important works of scholarship and public intellectualism, he is the recent author, along with Terry Moe from Stanford University, of a terrific book called Presidents, Populism, and the Crisis of Democracy. We also have Suzanne Mettler from Cornell. We're delighted to have her with us today. She is the John L. Senior Professor of American Institutions at Cornell, and she is also the author of many important books and articles, most recently co-authored with Robert Lieberman, a wonderful book about the sort of history of America's various close calls with non-democracy, entitled Four Threats: The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. That appeared last year with St. Martin's Press. And then we have Aziz Hook. We're fortunate to have Aziz with us as well. He is the Frank and Bernice J. Greenberg Professor of Law at the University of Chicago. And he is also the co-author of a recent very important book, along with Tom Ginsberg, who I think I see on my screen. And that book is called, he has a book called From Parchment to Practice, The First Period Problem in Constitutional Design. That came out in 2020, and that was edited with Tom Ginsberg. And they co-authored in 2018 a book called How to Save a Constitutional Democracy. And that was with the University of Chicago Press. So thank you all three for being here. And I'm just going to throw a question. I'm going to start with you, Will. And the first question I'm going to throw at you is, when you look back at the last 4 years, what do you find in retrospect to be sort of most alarming? And what do you find most reassuring in terms of the Trump period?
Boy, I mean, the challenge of this question is how do you pick, right? Because there was so much in play. Let me say thank you for bringing us together, Sue, and what a delight to be in conversation with you and Aziz and Suzanne. There's so much in play. I guess, look, I think alarming, on the alarming side, is when you think about the sheer volume of lies that were put into circulation, and the denigration of norms that we sort of almost grew numb to and learned to tolerate. I think I would say sort of it's the collective sense that these became something akin to, if not normal behavior, then certainly not something that warranted a political rebuke, a formal political rebuke. It's something that just was a part of the ether. And when you think about then the health of a democracy that depends upon a shared recognition of facts, that depends upon norms of reciprocity, that depends upon some basic norms about how we govern as a country, these were really denigrated in profound ways. So I think on that side, I would rank them, if not at the top, they're certainly in the top 5 concerns that we ought to have. The reassurance side, I don't know. I mean, you hear these sort of moments where in the election that the administrators in Georgia refused to be bullied by the president and held firm, and that we're meant to find reassurance from that. And of course I think we do, but then you also think, is that how close we were? Right? This sense that it was on the backs of a handful of election administrators that is what made sure that we in fact saw through the certification of the results of the election and the transfer of power. Likewise, we're accustomed to saying things like, well, it didn't all sort of fall apart, right? That in important ways, the institutions provided resistance to the president. And I think that's decidedly true. This is not, the last 4 years were not a period where Trump got everything that he wanted. He was thwarted again and again and again. But there too, I guess I would say, the question is, what is our standards? Are we meant to sort of, in the end, find reassurance in a set of institutions that make change very difficult and that block and that in the end held out and provided some resistance against a president? The answer is, I guess, to my mind, is both yes and no. It's at once, yes, we didn't entirely lose our democracy. That's decidedly true. But boy, we were close.
Suzanne, I'm going to ask you the same question. Pick out what scares you retrospectively the most, and what you find most reassuring.
Great. Well, thank you for convening us, and it's lovely to be here with all of you to have this conversation. When we think about what was most alarming, there's a lot of competition for the answer to that question. I mean, the list is really long, and I feel like if you had asked me that question, at any point during the last 4 years, I would have had different answers depending upon what was top of mind that month, that week, that day. But I have to say, though, at this juncture, I think that what tops all of the most alarming events and developments was Trump's denial of the election outcome and his efforts to overturn it. And then so many elected Republican officials joining him in that effort. If you think about what does it take to have a democracy, which I think, growing up when all of us did in the United States, we got to take a lot of this for granted. We didn't have to think about these really fundamental features of democracy. But of course, having competitive elections is crucial. And that means, Adam Jaworski says that the definition of democracy is a system in which parties lose elections. So in any election, there's going to be a loser. And you have to decide in advance on what are the rules of the game. And we're all going to play by the rules, and someone's going to lose, and they have to step aside. And when a party is unwilling to do that, democracy can go to the wayside. So that's what Trump was trying to do all year long in 2020 by trying to discourage people from voting, trying to stack the deck in all sorts of ways. And then after the election, trying to deny the outcome. And, he managed to convince a majority of Republicans that he was the rightful winner, and people still believe that, which is very troubling, I think, for the future of the legitimacy of our elections. And he managed to get a good many of his fellow Republican leaders to go along with him. I mean, even after the insurrection on the Capitol on January 6th, when, very courageously Congress came back together and completed their business, which was excellent for democracy. But 139 members of the House voted not to recognize the outcome in a couple of states, or at least one state, each of those 139, and several senators the same. that's just very troubling for the future of democracy. And, you know, there's a whole list of other things that were problematic that it would be great to talk about as well. But I think I'd put that at the top of the list. In terms of what's most reassuring, you know, I agree with everything that Will said. But I would add to the list that it's very important when, you know, you have such strong polarization and one party wants to override democracy in order to win and stay in power. It's really important that the other party is standing up for democracy. And the Democratic Party has been doing that, and also was able to beat its way back in 2018 and to, you know, win the House of Representatives, which then put a block on what Trump could do. And that was very important. I mean, regardless of where one stands on policy positions with respect to either party, I think this was crucial for upholding democracy. So yeah, many other things to say, but I'll start with that.
Great, thank you. Aziz, I think I hear Suzanne saying that, and Will as well, saying that it's, you know, one of the, when we think about some of the most frightening things that happened, one of them was the reluctance or the refusal of the losing candidate, who was the incumbent, to accept that loss and step down peaceably. But combined with that, you know, if that had been his stance, but the country was united in saying, no, we had a free and fair election, you have to stand down. Instead, what we had was now what we have is sort of two halves of the country, both of whom think of each other as having tried and to steal an election. How much does that worry you? Do you agree about these assessments of how close we came, how bad things looked, and what do you see as the brighter spots?
Sure. So let me start off by thanking you, Sue and Kevin, for setting this up. You know, I intend to say the brightest spot is getting to have conversations like this. That would be a slightly facetious, but not too facetious. I think it may actually be true, even if it is facetious. If I had to identify, and I think this takes an element of your question and works with it. If I had to identify a single thing that has always troubled me the most, it's the invariance of Trump's level of popular support. Right? That his level of popular support never dipped below 30%. And the various measures that he took post November the 6th to derail the fair counting of the vote and to persuade sitting legislators or elected officials or judges to either find votes, literally, or to throw through some casuistic legal technology the election to him. All of those efforts rested at the end of the day upon the existence of that 30%, right? Because the behavior of particularly the state and the local officials, and I think also the behavior of judges, is deeply influenced by the levels of public support and the capacity for anti-democratic action in the interregnum between the election and Inauguration Day really depended upon the existence of that public support. And I think that maybe a way of answering the kind of the bright spot question is to say that I think that we really have learnt a great deal, and although we continue to learn about the nature and the origins of the anti-democratic threat and its kind of first causes as time has gone on. So I think that we have moved from an account which had a kind of an economic determinism flavor to it, right? This is the bitter and disillusioned Rust Belt story to a much more nuanced and complex account, where many of the electors who were among the 139 representatives who continued to resist certification in the wake of the January the 6th insurrection, and much of the insurrection itself, and much of the what we're now seeing playing out, and this has been, I think, rightly highlighted by the New York Times and other publications, is this wave of new anti-democratic measures, like redistricting Pennsylvania's judges. We're starting to understand this doesn't just come, or most importantly come, from a kind of disaffected Rust Belt, which is experiencing the deaths of despair, or one or other of the kind of hillbilly elegy type stories, but rather this is coming from reasonably well-off suburban and exurban districts, which are experiencing periods of demographic and economic change, and where people feel deeply threatened by the facts of demographic and economic change. So I take it as a kind of positive that over time, our understanding of the social and popular predicates, the wellsprings of, or what makes possible the harms that Trump has inflicted, are coming better into view. And I think that that's a necessary first step before we start to think about how to address them.
If I could throw something out, which is that part of the challenge in trying to answer your question, Sue, is not just that there's such a long list, but also that they're all linked. So, I mean, listening to Suzanne, who points, I think, rightly to the, not just the insurrection, but the effort to overturn an election, right, as the sort of number one. What made that possible was all of not just the kind of groundwork that was laid in the lead up to the election, but the deep and anger and the populism that our country beforehand. I mean, it goes deep into the body politic. And if I could also say, Aziz, I agree with you. One, though, isn't to the exclusion of the other. That is, that one can simultaneously have lots of kind of disaffection, and you could tell the Rust Belt story and also talk about notions of threat. And as we think about what is the right story, I think one answer is there are many stories that have led to the rise of populism in contemporary American politics.
Suzanne, let me go back to you. Here's another question. What's going to happen to the Republican Party?
What's going to happen to the Republican Party? I couldn't hear you for a second.
Yeah, sorry, that was it. What's going to happen to the Republican Party?
Yeah, so, well, it's a good question, but I think that, those who are imagining the death of the Republican Party are, I think it's greatly exaggerated. If you look back over the last few decades, it's really incredible to see the transformation of the Republican Party from a party that, in the 1980s, during the Reagan years, was a strong, always a coalition. You're always going to have a big tent to have a successful American political party, since we just have two of them for the most part. So it was this successful coalition between fiscal conservatives and social conservatives. As we move forward into the 1990s, and Republican Party leaders are trying to become more competitive by taking, Newt Gingrich leading the way, trying to really play a sort of combative politics. So there's a whole new generation of members of Congress, someone like John Boehner, for example, at that point in time, who seemed kind of extreme in that way. But then you go forward a couple of decades, and those who seemed extreme at that point start to seem like the real moderates or the governing coalition or governing wing of the Republican Party. And that just keeps happening over time. So, it's not that the party has changed all that dramatically in policy terms, I don't think. It's really more in its combativeness. It's that it has become more extreme over time. And so I think that is going to continue to happen. And the question, I guess, is how can it prevail becoming such an extreme party? Like we used to think, political scientists used to think not that long ago that American politics was driven by the median voter, the person in the middle, and that both parties were competing for the support of that person. But as polarization has grown, that's not the case, and there doesn't seem to be much catering to the middle. But I think the Republican Party is able to prevail even as it becomes more extreme, in part because of its rural base. And rural voting became all the more supportive of the Republican Party in 2016 and 2020. It had long been supportive, but all the more so. And Democrats that used to be competitive in various rural areas have become much less so, particularly since the late 1990s. So this rural-urban divide has really grown. And that's significant because there are institutional features of American politics that give extra leverage to rural areas. Through the structure of the US Senate, through the Electoral College, and also through single member districts that, when you have a population that is sorted out between the two parties dividing rural and urban, it's almost impossible to draw districts that are going to be competitive. And then the other couple of factors about why the Republicans can continue to be very strong, even if they become very extreme, is that they have a strong organized base, more so than Democrats, in terms of organizations that are there day in and day out, evangelical churches, the Fraternal Order of Police, gun clubs, all of these which are really important for connecting people to politics. And the party, the last thing I'd mention is that as the American population has become much more diverse racially and ethnically, the Democratic Party has kept up with that change. The Republican Party has remained a more homogenous party. And I'm drawing now on the work of someone like Lily Mason, political psychologist, who argues that when you're in a more homogenous group and you lose an election, you take it as a personal affront. You feel very much under threat yourself, but that makes people angry, and it makes them more likely to mobilize to try to win elections.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Will, I want to ask you, is the Republican Party going to divide? Is one group going to beat out the other? If we look ahead next decade, are we going to have a different second party, a different party competing with the Democratic Party? Tell us what you think.
Well, I agree with everything that Suzanne just said. I think I would add two elements to it, which is one, the key divide that we're seeing is traditional conservatives and populists. And that's the battle that's being waged. And who's likely to emerge triumphant? I think all signs point towards the growth industry is with the populists. They're the wing that came out of, when you point to the 139 members of the House that saw fit to vote against the certification of the results. It was because of not Trump per se, but populism, which has taken hold of the party, which doesn't have a clear policy agenda. But I think I like the way that Suzanne put it, which is that it's not just, it's combative, it's anti-democratic. It's about opposition all the way through. It's not putting forward a constructive agenda, but therein lies, that's a kind of a key feature of the Republican Party, which was not a dominant feature. It's been a part of the Republican Party for a long time, but not a dominant part the way that it is now. The other thing that I would point to, at least when we think about what keeps Republicans competitive going forward. One is that they benefit from anti-democratic, small d democratic features of our political system, but they are also, and I'm going to come out and sort of provide even more edge to the critique here, they also are an anti-democratic party, that they're the party that is trying to restrict the franchise, that is trying to make it more difficult to vote. And they do so in ways that are not just expressed in public opinion polls, they're doing so with a whole lot of money behind it and a whole lot of strategy behind it. And that will keep them competitive in places where a sort of a kind of in even if we fix the location, urban, rural, but we just make it more democratic, we expand the franchise. Well, Republicans stand to lose, and so they're doing everything they can to push back. So those are two elements: populism, anti-democratic kind of efforts on the part of the Republican Party.
But Will, you don't see an opportunity for Republicans to sort of say, okay, we need to compete by making some alterations to our policy positions. You don't see a room for, in many situations, in many countries, the sort of mix of populations and preferences and generational changes lead to changes in what people want from their government. And political parties have incentives to respond to those pressures. You don't see that happening here?
Not in the short term, because I think the Republicans continue to win. I mean, they lost the presidency, but Trump still got 75 million votes, and they performed well, and they picked up seats in the House. And then the only reason why they lost the Senate was because of what happened in Georgia. And they're doing really well at the state level. And so until they start losing, I don't think we're going to see. I mean, this was in the aftermath of Romney's loss. The call was we need, the Republican Party needs to appeal to more groups and moderate its positions. Right now, I don't hear or see evidence of those voices taking hold of the party in any meaningful respect. And until they lose big and lose consistently, I don't think that they will.
I want to ask each of you a question, and I'm going to start with Aziz, but I also want to encourage members of the audience, if you have questions, please feel free to raise your hand, use the little reactions button down at the bottom of your screen up to the right, and raise your hand, and we're happy to have you. You'll get unmuted, and happy to have you pose questions. But Aziz, let me start with you. I'm going to let you wave your magic wand and make one change that's going to help the U.S. avoid kind of dangers to our democratic system going forward. What would you do?
So I think the easiest answer to that question is pass some version of HR 1, which is the omnibus measure of democracy enlarging or franchise expanding measures that was percolating in the previous Congress, and that I expect will be introduced. And that there's a question perhaps of how much can be enacted through some version of a reconciliation process, which is, I expect, the only way that could be enacted. The wrinkle or I think that the real problem that will confront that kind of legislative democracy-related reform, right? Addressing explicitly the kind of potentiality for anti-democratic small d maneuvering that Will and Suzanne have just described is the courts. And I think that what I'm going to say is responsive to your question, Suzanne, Susan, but also builds upon what Will and Suzanne just said, that I think that there's an idea that's circulating that the courts performed well in the post-election moment because Trump lost all of his challenges. And I think that fundamentally misconceives the role of the courts as an adjunct in the Republican political project, right? Remember that some 230 judges were appointed to the federal bench by President Trump, and those judges are really important because there are at least 4 salients along which the anti-democratic measures that will keep the Republican Party from having the incentive to reform itself get played out. So one is the fact that the courts, as they are currently composed, are going to apply very low levels of scrutiny to measures such as voter ID or limits on vote by mail that are intended and have the effect of shrinking the Democratic base. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the courts as currently constituted are going to open the doors wider to campaign donations by not so much corporations, but by the super wealthy individuals in ways that have the effect of driving the polarization, particularly on the Republican Party elite level. The third thing that courts are going to do is they're going to use the Voting Rights Act, and they're going to use the Roberts Court's opinions on redistricting to keep the gates open for partisan redistricting, which will largely benefit the Republicans because of the way that the state level elections in November 2020 turned out, and such that it's largely going to be Republican state houses that are going to be doing the legislative line drawing, and the Supreme Court's given a green light to whatever kinds of entrenchment they wish to do. And then finally, there's one of the measures that's been proposed to remedy particularly the redistricting problem is the use of independent redistricting commissions. A few years ago, the Supreme Court rejected a challenge to independent redistricting commissions based upon a theory of Article 1, Section 4 of the Constitution, with a majority opinion in which Justice Kennedy was the deciding vote. Justice Kennedy is no longer on the court. That case would almost certainly come out the other way. Those states that have independent redistricting commissions, at some point they're going to get challenged. At some point, the provisions in HR 1 that take power away from those local offices that Republicans are in the process of capturing in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania are going to be handed back the power to write election rules and to redistrict by the Supreme Court. So I think that the points that both the opportunity and the challenge run through the federal courts, which in a really important way have to be understood as adjuncts to the anti-democratic project that Will and Suzanne are describing.
Thank you, Aziz. I think what I hear you saying is credit the courts once the ballots are cast, once they're certified, or even just when they're cast before they're certified. We're not going to go along with the project of wiping out an election that's been free and fair. But that doesn't mean we're going to open up ballot access. It doesn't mean we're going to put the kibosh on gerrymandering and so on.
Yeah.
In case anyone was getting too relieved about the role of the courts. We have some hands up. Let me just quickly turn to Will. Answer the same question. I'm giving you a magic wand. What are you going to change?
Build a more effective government. That's the answer. So the center that we run is the Center for Effective Government. The book that I wrote was arguing that in important ways, if the threat to our democracy is the rise of populism, it's born of the government's incapacity, failure to solve problems that large segments of the American public expect to see solved. And so the way to make inroads on the problem, I mean, this is, again, I have like what Aziz just laid out. I'm all on board with that. I would also say we need a set of institutions that can materially solve problems, and we don't have them right now.
Will, just give us one thing at the top of your list of how to bring that about.
Oh gosh. Okay, so that's chapter 4 of our book. So we reimagine the presidency. Let me give you one. The one that attracts the most attention is to rethink agenda setting powers that presidents have. They could introduce legislation that then has to be voted on in Congress. Basically, what you want to focus, key thing to focus in on is the legislative process itself, which is broken in important respects, at least when it comes to our capacity to build the kinds of legislation that we need to meet challenges that are national, if not international in scope, highly complex. Think like comprehensive immigration reform. Think about the tax code as a whole, healthcare reform, these kinds of things. We need to reconstitute the legislative process. Agenda setting power would be a part of it. There's a lot more though in play.
Suzanne, I'm giving you the magic wand now.
Yeah, I like hearing actually what both have said, but to add a little bit to what Will is saying, I would say that, you know, the work of government through administrative agencies has been suffering for decades. Usually, you know, the parties kind of take turns in trying to downsize and undermine different agencies. And then Trump came along and, you know, he's talking about the deep state and was really going after the legitimacy of government. I think, you know, then we come to a pandemic and here you have the CDC, which is an agency that had been very highly respected for Americans of both parties in the past. And it becomes really hamstrung in its ability to do its work in many ways. So I think that trying to rebuild, to strengthen those agencies, both through their personnel, the resources for them, their legitimacy, and also the visibility of what they do. This is really important that, you know, in fact, you know, before the past 4 years, many of those agencies actually had good reputations, even though when people are asked in polls, you know, their view about the federal government, they'll say they have, you know, only like less than 1 in 5 Americans would say they had confidence in the federal government in Washington to do what was right most or all of the time. And yet these individual agencies, people had a lot of respect for, that people often don't connect the services that they receive with government. And so I think that efforts to really make that more clear, both to design policies in ways where it's more clear that people are benefiting from government, and then also just to connect those dots so people see what government is doing could really be helpful.
So what would you do?
What would I do?
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, this isn't an answer to that question. Going back to the question of what scared me, I'm someone who has studied democracies in countries where you kind of expect there to be a lot of hiccups and a lot of conflicts and difficulties, you know, Peru, Argentina. And I am as shocked as anyone at how fragile our democracy appears to have turned out to be. Now, if I had had the, you know, benefit of reading your books earlier, especially Suzanne's book about the history of difficulties in our country and Will's, you know, deep analyses of the sources of some of the sources of institutional problems, and you know, and Aziz and Tom's book about constitutional sources of some of these difficulties, maybe I wouldn't have been as surprised. But I guess I was shocked at and what continues to shock me is the kind of fragility of our system to a cult leader. You know, and I think this goes back to Aziz's comment about the, you know, the unshakability of the on the downside of Trump's popularity. You know, if we had a cult leader who was extremely adept at developing a minority, but a large minority of very, very committed followers who would believe sort of anything that he said. And that is such an enormous shadow, continues to be such an enormous shadow over our country. And that's a difficult one to point to a kind of institutional fix for. You know, I completely agree with and have learned so much from the work of all three of you in terms of some of the things that we could change. I mean, I personally also think that we need a much better election administration system. I'm shocked that you've heard me say this before, that, you know, if you look at it at a better system, you need to go no further than Mexico, which was an authoritarian system until 2000. They have a much better system of voter registration roll updating and you know, and district drawing and so on, everything that you can think about. So that would be where, you know, my magic wand would go in that direction, but it doesn't solve the problem of the kind of political cultural problem we have of, you know, of our the sort of truth basis of our democracy being so fragile. So we've got some hands up, and now we're gonna try hard. Kevin, I'm gonna say a name and you're gonna unmute that person. So be patient. Tom Ginsburg wanted to ask a question.
There we go. Yeah, so first of all, in terms of just a comment, in terms of the magic bullet reforms, I was surprised not to hear any of you say ranked choice voting, which many of us believe would be, kind of actually a magic bullet. But my question for you is about, parties and maybe what we know comparatively about parties. Like at this point, the MAGA party, the Republican, the Confederate Party, whatever you want to call it, is really a grassroots phenomenon. And I guess, do you see, big business going back to it? And if not, can it actually, is it actually as much of a threat if it's merely voters and not money? And it's just, I don't know, because I've been sort of grew up in an environment, we always think, oh, money in politics, it's terrible. This is a phenomenon where money isn't the key factor. How does that play out?
Panelists, somebody want to take that on?
One thought that comes to mind, Tom, is that the money that's already been spent by the Chamber of Commerce and the like has gone into building infrastructure at the level of the state. And Suzanne mentioned some of this, but I would add to what she said, institutions like ALEC and other kind of vectors for policy, anti-democratic policy making at the state level, that where the infrastructure is not going to go away. So yeah, the Chamber of Commerce, maybe some of these big money donors will shift away or be less enthusiastic about certain elements of the Republican Party, but the money that's been spent is not going to disappear. It continues to have an effect.
I would also add that the moneyed interests have made out like bandits over the last 4 years. So I mean, I think that that's not to say that they are coming from the same place or that evaluate policy in the same way as the kind of populist base. But the last 4 years have been very good to, moneyed interests. Jacob Hacker and Paul Pearson's recent book does a really nice job of pulling this together. And so that may change. I mean, they're hanging together. This kind of strange coalition is still hanging together so far, but and that may change in the future. But boy, it's hard to see why, if what you care about are low taxes and less regulation. Last 4 years have been very good to you.
I agree with that. And I'd also like to bring in, Theda Scotchpole's insight that organization can matter at least as much or more than money in politics. And I think that this MAGA party, really has this strong organized base that gets out elections. And so they can carry on and be quite successful.
We have a question from Chandler James. Chandler, do you want to, let's see if we can unmute you.
Hi, this is great. Sue, I want to pick up on a point that you were making, but I want to ask a question for Suzanne, because I think that I'm interested in hearing what she has to say, given her research. So Trump earned over 74 million votes. Why is anti-democratic politics normal, even rewarding in this time, in this age?
Yeah, so here I'll need to be channeling my co-author Rob Lieberman, as well as myself, from our book, Four Threats, The Recurring Crises of American Democracy. So we've learned a lot from scholars of comparative politics like Sue about threats to democracy around the world. And so there were four threats that we focused on, and that can make democracies deteriorate, undergo backsliding. So the four are political polarization, the rise of conflict over who belongs, which in the United States is time and again about white supremacy and racism, particularly when that conflict gets organized into the party system. I mean, you have, racism throughout American history, but sometimes you have one party really working for greater equality and the other party saying, we want to protect our way of life, our heritage, etc. The third threat is high and rising economic inequality. And the fourth is executive aggrandizement, or in the US, the powers of the presidency. And so these four threats wax and wane and have different patterns in American history. And when you have even one of them, democracy can be endangered. When you get three of them, it led to the Civil War in the 1850s and the 1890s. It led to the disenfranchisement of millions of African-American men, and that lasted 60 years. Today, for the first time ever in this period, we have all four threats, the confluence of all four threats. So we argue that, that makes things particularly dangerous because these threats are now interacting with each other in ways that, that make them particularly dangerous. And so that's why we think this is happening at this time. And, Trump was a symptom of all of that, not a cause. Once he was president, he ratcheted up each of those threats and leaves them worse than when he came into the White House. But that's what we see going on.
Mark Hansen has his hand up. I'd love to bring you into the conversation, Mark.
Yeah, hi, thank you. So I haven't heard anyone talk yet about nominations in political parties. I mean, it seems to me that the Trump phenomenon is largely that we had the hostile takeover of one of the two major parties from within, basically running through the primary system to get the nomination. Trump was the first nominee who had no experience whatsoever in government in any way, shape, or form before getting the nomination. I like to joke in the talks I gave that he'd never even been president of his condo association. The only other person who had no previous experience either in the military or in government who'd gotten a major party nomination was Wendell Willkie in 1940. But Willkie was representative actually of the kind of people who got nominations back when the nominations were actually overseen by party elites. It was people who bought into the system, people who contributed to the system in some way. And it appears, looking back on things, that it was people who were bought into the values of the system. The parties didn't nominate demagogues. Demagogues didn't get that far because they had to have gotten elected as governor or as senator or something like that. And it was basically working your way up in the system. And so I sort of wonder the degree to which we ought to be focused as well on, who it is that gets put forward in a position, George Wallace had to run on a third party ticket. Donald Trump ran as a Republican, and in 2016, it seems to me most of Donald Trump's support in the general election was because he was a Republican nominee and not because of Donald Trump.
That sounds right.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I think that Mark has exactly right. I guess I would say though that the reduction of influence as parties in determining internally who is going to put forward, the rise of primaries, the decline of superdelegates, all of this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition that in order to offer an explanation for the rise of Trump. You also still need, that's the explanation for why you might get an outsider, but why would you get an outsider who's opposed to the system, who is a demagogue, who is going to talk about how everything is rigged and broken, and then just rise to power in opposition to the system of government, but also once in power work to undermine it. And for that, we just need to bring even more into the conversation. But it certainly is true. It's unimaginable that Trump would have been the Republican Party in 20 years ago.
There's a line of legal scholarship, most importantly by Stephen Godbaum at UCLA and Rick Pilders at NYU, that looks at the way in which the presidential nomination process has changed over time. That work tends to support, or it does support what Will just said, that both parties, starting in the 1960s, dramatically loosened the control that the kind of permanent party apparatus, the national committees and the like, had over the nominating process, in part as a response to electoral defeats that were perceived as being a consequence of having too establishment, too not sufficiently popular, as opposed to populist, a candidate, and that this opened the door to the Trump nomination in 2016. Of course, as Will said, there's a timing problem with that story. That the loosening of the nomination happens decades before Trump, and it happens on both sides. And yes, you can tell a story about how Obama, in some senses, is something of an outsider when he makes a play for the Democratic nomination in 2008. But the comparison there seems a bit strained to me, and one needs much more by way of an explanation as to why the party as such fails so abysmally to rally around the consensus candidate, be it Cruz or Kasich in 2016, leaving the gate open for Trump.
Yeah, and I would add to that also that, as Julia Azari likes to say, we're in an era of strong partisanship, but weak parties as organizations. So of course, we see real partisan voting on Capitol Hill and among the electorate, where people are very true to their party, even if it's because among citizens, because they especially dislike the candidate of the other party. But party organizations at the state and local level have become weaker. And so the parties don't have the same kind of power they did in the past to control, nominations and to really influence them, to influence the outcome. I think it's also the case that, there had been this gradual shift going on over many decades in the Republican Party, with the that made it vulnerable to a candidate who really thrived on grievance. Mitt Romney did not cater to that base, and neither did John McCain, but Trump came along and he did. And he really took advantage of an opportunity that had probably been there for a while, but other leaders hadn't been going after it, to really play up racism and nativism and grievance. And it worked for him.
I wanted to ask Mark and the rest of you as well. So one of the things we've learned a lot about in the last few days about the primary process for the Senate elections in Alaska. So there's a case where Senator Murkowski seems to be relatively safe in taking a position that's antagonistic toward the kind of core base of her own Republican Party there, because there is an open primary system. Now, that's not a method for strengthening parties, maybe quite to the contrary, but what do you think about that? Mark, if you had a magic wand, would you like that kind of change, or anyone, how to deal with the problem that Mark is focusing on?
Yeah, that's a good question. These jungle primaries, which are in effect in California, and Louisiana's had one for years and years and years. The argument is that they produce more centrist candidates, and I suppose maybe there's some truth to that. If one imagined that at the presidential level, well, then the alienation of the business conservatives from MAGA might actually have an effect. Because it wouldn't require the business conservatives to vote for Democrats. They they could basically conspire to get, a candidate who's actually electable by the electorate at large from some kind of national jungle primary. So I don't know, maybe something looks like that. But I'm also, I think back, we've known for years and years and years, this goes back to some of the work that was done even right after World War II by people like Adorno and the like. We know that the American public, in fact, will profess allegiance in the abstract to democratic values, but when you actually push them about specific cases, they don't give a damn about about democratic values. And so it seems to me that if we're really going to address this problem, we have to get back to the days when there were basically cross-party conspiracies to deny a choice to people on certain issues. And one of those was whether you would have the ability to vote for someone like Donald Trump or not. So it does seem to me that I'm not sure we can actually rely on the grassroots for this, but that we have to rely on some kind of institutional means to make sure that we have people who aren't going to do things like not concede an election that they've lost.
This, I think, goes to the question too that Chandler raised, which is that it isn't just how is it that so many people were willing to countenance the anti-democratic behavior of Trump, but appeared to be rewarding it in some ways, appeared to be getting behind it. And I think part of where that comes from, and which is why I think Mark is really onto something here. Part of where that comes from is, again, this basic sense that everything is broken, everything is rigged. I mean, if you buy into that's at the core of what Trump's argument is. Everything is illegitimate and broken and rigged. And he, because he stands apart from that wreckage, offers a chance to deliver anew, not just the rewards of government, but a sense of an affirmation of what it means to be American, all of that. And in that sense, pushing back against the election, right? Well, there's a certain valor to that. It's about overcoming constitutional impediments, electoral impediments, is because you're fighting the good fight, because you're fighting against not just rot, but a system that is corrosive and rigged. And when that sensibility really takes hold within a public, it's not coincidental that then our commitments to democracy and the attractions of autocracy, the former dwindles and the latter comes into view.
I would put two small points on the table. One is it's worth recalling back in 2018 that there was a fleeting moment of big D democratic anxiety over the jungle primary in a number of California seats for fear that the Democrats were knocking their own best candidates out of play. Or we're siphoning votes off from each other and allowing the Republican yielding a general election in which there wasn't a viable Democratic candidate, which suggested to me that be careful of what you wish for with respect to reforms, because the reform is going to work out actually on the ground very differently in different circumstances, and it turns out to be really hard to predict what a reform like the jungle primary is going to do. And then just in response to Will's point, if one looks at the accounts which are somewhat anecdotal and then somewhat sociological of the support behind the anti-democratic parties in Eastern Europe, like Fidesz and the Law and Justice Party, there isn't quite the same story. And there is instead a story of supporters who felt that they were not getting their their fair share, that they had lost out in post fall of the Berlin Wall, capitalism and democracy. And the account suggested it wasn't that people had lost out unfairly. It was just that they'd lost out. And the move from a kind of transparent legalistic system to a fundamentally clientistic, nepotistic system created a new set of opportunities for people who would otherwise be losers in what we would characterize as a fair system. So, I think that there are a number of different stories, and this goes back to actually something that Will said about pluralism, about the kind of narrative accounts that one wants to give. I wonder how much there are different stories that one needs to tell about the psychological attraction of the anti-democratic position, right? There is no, Mark invoked Adorno. There's no one authoritarian personality. Maybe there's a cluster, and there are different ways you get to that kind of posture, and we shouldn't assume it's singular.
I'm afraid we're out of time. This has been a fascinating conversation. I'm so grateful to our panelists and also to our audience. These problems are not resolved. These topics are not exhausted. We will continue to have more conversations in the future. Keep your eye on the activities of the Chicago Center on Democracy, and have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you all. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks
As
so
have
much.
I. Thank you.
Thank you.